Welcome to Ratio Christi. It is week 6, if you can believe it. That means that we are 1/3 of the way through the semester, including finals week. 1/3 of the way through. I had a professor who was in charge of senior design projects for my department, and he would always post this big sign outside of his office that says, "This is week blank." It would be 6, just to kind of scare people into working on their projects because the end of the semester was approaching. So hopefully I didn't scare any of you with the fact that it's week 6 and we're 1/3 of the way done. Maybe that's also a good thought, I don't know. So anyway, usual announcements for Ratio Christi, I guess. We have food over there. The quality of the sign is much improved from last week, although foods is still spelled wrong. So I guess we still have some improvement to do. Food over there, pinwheels, puppy chow, and then drinks, because we didn't know drinks started with P words, so we couldn't do the alliteration, but that's okay. We got, sorry, I'm just kind of like ripping on your work, aren't I? Sorry. Anyway.
It's okay, we're taking breaks.
Okay. Oh well. So we got the cards back there. They have both of our monthly events. By the way, our monthly event is happening in a little under 2 weeks, Monday, October 14th. It will be at Grace Hall, room 105. We'll be discussing Does God Exist? That will be our topic. I think we're publicizing this the most we ever have. We've got posters in every single dorm on every single floor. And we've got signs on the digital signage in the union. So if you watch those screens that just kind of switch between different things, we've got one of those. And then the dining hall, so we should be pretty well prepared for that. We can sign up for our email. If you don't get that yet, why don't you? But sign up for our email, and if you want to, there's, I think, cards to do that back there, or just talk to Wesley back there, who raised his hand, and he can get you signed up for the email. That way you know what we're doing, you know where we're eating. We were at Sultan's Kite, so we had some Mediterranean earlier tonight. That'll give you all the information, all the resources, everything you could possibly want to know is in that email. But there's also our social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We only have 5 followers on Twitter. Please follow us, even out of pity. We want you to follow us, right? But no, great informative content on Twitter as well. So anyway, special things coming up. I think tomorrow, yes it is tomorrow, is the event that we're doing, partnering with Crew, doing evangelism on UNL's campus. That will be taking place tomorrow. And it'll be kind of a two-part thing to that. There'll be the part where people are actually going out and talking to people in the union area and in front of the union about Jesus, using perspective cards that Crew has. And so they'll be meeting near the union at 10:45 tomorrow to start that. So we would invite you to come and join in that effort. And then as part 2 of that, Ratio Christi will have a table out there to kind of answer hard questions that people have about Christianity. And that will be running from, again, about 10:45 on through 3, I think. So again, come join us for that, either the tabling or the evangelism part, and we'd love to see you there to help answer people's questions and tell them about our faith in Jesus Christ. So I think that is all the little announcements and various things we have. I guess t-shirts are still a thing that we haven't ordered, so if you're interested in one of those that say Ratio Christianum, talk to Ben or Wesley. And then also, if you're a UNL student who wants to be an official voting member of Ratio Christi for administrative purposes, that work comes into effect in the spring. But if that's something you want, talk to me and you can get signed up for that. So, without further ado, I think we are going to bring up our speaker, who you know very well. It's our chapter director, Adam Johnson, continuing in our What is Jesus series. Not what. Who? Did I say that last week too? Who is Jesus series? What is the evidence?
Why is Jesus? How is Jesus?
Which, whence, whither, those old ones? Don't let you move the microphone.
Oh, I'll jump over. Jump rope.
One.
All right. As he said, follow us on social media. It's a great way to help us promote the group. As I often say, we can only help people if they're aware of us. So our passion in Ratio Christi is to serve other people with the gifts and abilities God's given us. And people don't know that we're here to serve them unless they're aware of our ministry. So utilize social media, and that will help us get the word out. You know how things happen on social media. Things can go viral overnight. So help us make that happen. I always like to remind us that we're meeting in a church. It might not look like a normal church or feel like a normal church in a basement of a building downtown. But I'm very proud of these folks for starting a church here instead of out in the suburbs. That's needed too. But they had a passion to have the church, their church, be downtown in the midst of the city, the midst of life down here. And in particular, they have a heart for college students. So if you're new to Lincoln, or if you're looking for church, I would encourage you to try out University Church right here, Sunday mornings at 11. Well, I want to do a little bit of review, just to kind of get us back on track to what we're doing this semester. As Joel mentioned, our theme is, who is Jesus? The entire semester we're talking about Jesus Christ, and as a Christian organization, we're trying to make the case that Jesus, in fact, is God. He is deity, He is divine, He has all those omnipowers, omnipotence, omniscience, etc., etc. We're making the case that Jesus is God. Now we're doing that in a very particular way, and I want to run you through just a summary of the whole semester, at least the first argument we're taking a look at. A couple different ways you can argue for the divinity of Jesus, but we're starting out with this first argument. The first question we asked was, did Jesus even exist? Talking about Jesus, the man, the human being. And there's good historical evidence that he did. Okay. Second question we asked is, did he himself claim to be God? Because one of the ideas floating around out there, especially at the popular level, was that he himself never claimed to be divine. That was just a legend that his followers made up much later. But no, in fact, we saw and will see more evidence that historically Jesus himself thought he was God. Now, it's one thing for somebody to say they're God. A lot of people have said that through history. But why should we believe his claim? If somebody came up to you on the street and claimed to be God, most likely we would be skeptical. Rightfully so. So why should we think that Jesus was who he claimed to be? And I think the bottom line, the best answer to that question is miracles. Because of the miracles that he was able to perform, that provides authentication, credibility, if you will, to his claim. That is the purpose of miracles, to authenticate the message. Now, I think this is so important to this argument. In fact, I think this particular point is probably the key to this entire first argument. This idea of miracles. Because they help us to know if something is really from God or not. We use the example of maybe in ancient days, when a king wanted to communicate, he would put on that letter or that piece of paper a seal from a signet ring that only he had. And that would be a way to authenticate that the letter was really from the king. We might nowadays use our signature. You know, our signatures are unique. Experts in that field of signatures can come and evaluate it if it gets to that level, right? Evaluate if a signature is really by that person, because that helps authenticate, so much so that we use this in our contracts, our official legal documents. Our signature provides that unique imprint as authentication that it's really us that the letter is from. And miracles perform that function. Now, I want to touch on this, maybe just a little bit, some added points to this issue, because we've talked about this a couple weeks ago now. One thing I wanted to qualify here on this topic, I wanted to say that miracles don't provide absolute proof. Okay? If you got that impression, I apologize. That's not what I meant to say. That's not what I meant to communicate. Miracles aren't absolute proof that a message is really from God or that the person doing it really is God. And this is why I think Wesley's lecture was so helpful last week. I lost Wesley. There he is. This is why I think his lecture was so helpful last week, because we often have too high of a level of skepticism. What was the The skeptometer, is that right? The skeptometer for many of us often is too high. And one of the reasons why our skepticism is too high, when not necessarily in this context, but in many contexts, our skepticism is too high because we're looking for that absolute proof. This is something that I struggled with all throughout my 20s. I was a Christian, but I was struggling to know if Christianity was really true or not. And what I really wanted, I'll be honest, in my 20s, I just wanted some sort of a silver bullet, like just the perfect argument or the perfect piece of evidence that would prove Christianity was true or false. At that point in my life, I didn't care. I just wanted to know what was true. And I thought that there could be I was searching for this silver bullet, absolute proof that could tell me either way, finally, whether Christianity was true or not. And I think if we have that mindset, that's one of the reasons why our skepticism goes up so high, because we're not going to believe something unless we have that level of proof. Well, since my 20s, I've come to realize my position now is that that sort of proof, that sort of level of certainty is just not attainable. There is no such silver bullet when it comes to proof or arguments or evidence that is going to give us absolute certainty when it comes to Christianity or anything else. Because we're finite creatures, I'm convinced at least, that level of certainty is not something that we can attain. When we think that way, we're setting the bar too high. And that's why I appreciated some of the videos that Wesley showed, even though they were a bit snarky, from David Wood, that he would, if somebody has this level of skepticism, they're looking for absolute proof, then we can't even know if we exist. And so if somebody has that level of skepticism, you can turn it around on them in a loving, respectful way, just to show if that's your level, then you're not going to believe anything. This issue, you might be aware, in philosophy, is called epistemology. And no, I didn't just cuss. Epistemology comes from the Greek root word to know. And so in philosophy, epistemology is the study of how, as finite creatures, we can know things. What level of evidence or proof do we need before we can say that we know things? How close can we get to absolute certainty? And that's one of the things, this issue, you can see how it relates to Christianity, that led me to pursue a PhD in philosophy. Because I was so curious and so really desperate to understand this issue of human knowledge. So to circle back on what I'm saying, I want to make it clear, I'm not claiming that miracles provide this absolute certainty. I don't think there's anything that could give us absolute certainty when it comes to Jesus as God, Christianity is true. I'm not claiming that miracles have that sort of oomph or gravitas in our knowledge. All I'm saying is that I think this is a good epistemological principle. This is a good knowing principle, right? If X, Y, Z, then that helps us to know that A, B, C is true. Give you some examples. There's other principles of knowing, right? For instance, I think if you have a trusted friend who tells you something, I think that gives you justification to believe what they said, right? So you could think of that as an epistemological principle or a principle of knowing. The scientific method, I think, is a principle of knowing, right? The scientific method is a good way for us to discover something or to know something. So there's lots of different epistemological principles that are helpful in knowing things. But here's the point I'm trying to make tonight. None of these principles get us to absolute certainty. Scientific method doesn't get us to absolute certainty. Trusting a good friend doesn't get us to absolute certainty, nor does this principle that I'm proposing, miracles, get us to absolute certainty. You know, in one sense, the job of the skeptic is pretty easy, right? Think about it for a moment. The job of the skeptic is pretty easy. No matter, if it comes to Christianity or anything. If you want to play the skeptic, like David Wood was doing in those videos, if you want to play the skeptic, that's a fairly easy position because all you have to do is poke holes in somebody's epistemological principle or their argument and just poke holes in it. And you're always going to be able to poke holes in any epistemological principle. Scientific method, David Hume did that, etc., etc. You could always poke holes because there is no airtight epistemological principle. There's no airtight principle of knowing things that will get you absolute certainty. It's much more difficult to try to make the case for something. It's relatively easy to be the skeptic. It's more difficult to try to make the case that something is true. But we do that. We do it all the time. We just have to realize that we're not going to make our case with absolute certainty. So here's what I'm claiming in this stage of the argument. Why should we believe Jesus' miracles? Why should we believe his claim that he's God? Because of his miracles. In other words, again, if somebody comes up to you on the street, claims to be God, skeptical of their claim, but yet they can do miracles, that, all else being equal, is going to give you good reasons and evidence to trust their claim. Now, one of the best objections to this epistemological principle was brought up when we covered this, and that is the issue of demons or Satan. What if Satan could do these sort of supernatural things? Wouldn't that kind of ruin our epistemological principle here? And to fully address that objection, I'm developing a robust theology of Satan and demons. In other words, I want to spend a whole night, an entire lecture on this issue. It's a theological issue, right? Because a non-Christian doesn't believe in demons and Satan. The only way that we know about those beings is from the Scripture. So this is a theological issue. And I want to develop a very robust lecture that discusses what Satan and demons are able to do. So I want to look very thoroughly at their ability. What can they do? What can't they do? But until we get there, just so you know, my position, and I'm not alone in this, many theologians from history and contemporary theologians agree with me on this, that Satan, demons can't do miracles. And then that would solidify this epistemological principle that we've been arguing for. So I know that was quite a bit of review, but I had some strong thoughts about it that I wanted to share before we moved on in the argument, because I think this is really the critical hinge of the argument, this idea that miracles authenticate his claims. So before we move on, I want you guys to discuss something, and here's the question for you to spend a few minutes on at your table. I've been talking a lot. I think this is a very important epistemological principle for us to make our case for Christianity, but are there others? If somebody's going to make a case for Christianity, or make the case for, let's just narrow it down to Jesus being God, if somebody's going to make that case, right? What other epistemological principles might be helpful here? So besides the one, that I've been propounding, we know someone is from God or has a message from God because if they can do miracles, what other sort of principles of knowing could be helpful here? For example, we know someone is from God, or we know someone has a message from God if fill in the blank. What other things could help us to know this? Maybe you've been thinking about this yourself for a few weeks. Maybe you've got some ideas. So I'm going to give you a few minutes at your table to talk about this, brainstorm, And then lovingly, if somebody has an idea and you see some issues with that, play the skeptic. That's okay. Just don't be too snarky. All right, go ahead. All right. I've heard, a lot of other, in this conversation, other epistemological principles that are used, but I've never, in my opinion, heard one or discovered one that is as good, in my opinion, as this one. So this is my favorite. This is one that I find the most compelling, and I think it's the strongest epistemological principle. I heard a lot of people talk about prophecy, but I think technically prophecy would be encompassed in that as a miracle, right? Maybe it's not them doing that miracle, but it's a supernatural thing, right? It's a miraculous thing that was done that verifies them. Okay, well, let's move on. As you know, the biggest problem with miracles, though, isn't that people think it's not a good epistemological principle. In fact, most everybody I talk to thinks it's a good epistemological principle. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with atheists and non-Christians who have said, if a miracle would take place in front of me right now, I would believe. That just seems to be a very intuitive principle of knowing that we all have inside of us, almost a priori. Not that strong, but close to it. No, the bigger problem with this, with miracles, is that so many people nowadays think that they're impossible. As soon as you bring up the idea of the miraculous, they roll their eyes and they're done. And so we've had to spend several weeks now making the case for not actual miracles, but merely the possibility of miracles. And I put on your tables the outline for the semester. So if you have that in front of you, I think that'll help you track tonight and throughout the rest of the semester exactly what we're doing, where we're going, where we've been, etc., etc. So I started us off making the case that if there is a God, and that's what we spent the whole spring semester on, making the case that there is a God. If you accept that there is a God, it seems like you have to be open to at least the possibility of miracles. I think that's the best argument for the possibility of miracles, are arguments for the existence of God. So there's a proper order, I think, in which you do apologetics. You argue for the existence of God first, and then this gives you the tools necessary to make this argument, that Jesus is God because of his miracles. Wesley did a great job last week talking about our skepticism. We put the bar too high often. And then the last lecture we're going to do on this issue is we're going to bring in Dr. Bashford, one of the science professors at UNL, and he's going to address this question. Does science disprove miracles? Now, we were hoping to bring him in tonight. It didn't work out, so just put that, get a rain check, I suppose. Sometime later in the semester, we don't know the exact date he's going to be here, but he is going to give that lecture this semester for us. But in the meantime, we're moving on. So we can ask the question, the next thing that logically comes up is how do we know then about Jesus' claim to be God and his miracles? And we mostly know about this from the New Testament. Not exclusively. As we'll see over the next month, there's a lot of other extra-biblical evidence for Jesus' claim and his miracles that back up his claim. But mostly we know about these things from the New Testament. So that begs the question, is the New Testament reliable? Is the New Testament, that collection of documents, 27 documents, is it historically reliable? When it says that these things happened, Jesus walked on water, he was resurrected on the third day, can we trust these ancient documents? So that's what we're going to be looking at least for the next month, answering these questions. There's really two issues at play here. We're down to number 5 at the bottom. The first issue is, do we even have an accurate copy of these ancient documents? Because some people would say that they've been corrupted. Muslims would say they've been corrupted. Mormons would say they've been corrupted. A lot of non-Christians would say that the New Testament documents have been corrupted. We don't have an accurate copy of what the original said anymore. So we need to address that. And then secondly, and probably more importantly, how do we know, or why should we think that these documents are telling the truth? Because we might have an accurate copy of a bunch of lies. So what good reasons and evidence are there for us to believe what's written in the New Testament? Now this is going to feel odd to some of you, especially those of you maybe who grew up in the church, grew up as Christians. You're used to thinking of the New Testament as God's Word, and sometimes maybe you've even developed this pattern of thinking that, well, if the New Testament says it, it must be true because it's God's Word. We're going to make those sort of arguments. In fact, that's going to be our entire theme for next semester. The spring semester, we're going to be making the case that the Bible is God's Word, but that's not how we're using it here in this argument. And that's not how we're evaluating it. In other words, the argument I'm not making is that you should believe these miracles because the Bible says so. And everything the Bible says is true. That would be circular. No, we're evaluating the New Testament, at least for the purposes of this argument, merely as a collection of ancient documents. And if you're a Christian, you certainly believe that. You believe it's more than that, of course, and we'll give good reasons to believe it is more than that. But at this level, at this point of making the case for Christianity, we're only evaluating them as a collection of ancient documents and asking the questions that historians ask of them. How do we know they're historically reliable? So we're not going to be wearing our theological hats this semester. We'll do that next semester. This semester, we're just wearing our historian hats. So tonight we're going to start with the first issue, and that is, do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament? Do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament? Sometimes people ask, especially when I do this with youth groups and stuff, they say, well, why don't we just go look at the original? If we want to know if we have an accurate copy, why don't we just compare it to the original, and then we can save all this work, right? So I give them a pop quiz. I say, okay, what museum in the world hosts the original New Testament? Where can you go in the world to look at the original New Testament? And a lot of answers are thrown out, maybe the Vatican, maybe that famous museum in France, however you pronounce it. But no, the problem is, right, the issue here, we don't have the original New Testament. Gasp, awe. I joke around about this, but seriously, a lot of folks in the church aren't aware of this. And my concern is for, children, teenagers growing up in the church not even being aware of how we have the copy of the Bible that we have today. Because if we don't even know how we came about, how can we defend that it's trustworthy historically if we don't even know how we got it? So no, we don't have the original New Testament. And that sometimes when people aren't aware and they go off to college and hear some of these things for the first time, it causes them to really struggle with their faith. So we want to put this out and help people understand why we think we have an accurate copy of the original. The problem is originals just don't last forever, right? Especially from the ancient world. Things deteriorate. They didn't save documents like we're able to do. You can go look at our original Declaration of Independence, our original United States Constitution, but they didn't have a lot of those technologies, nor were a lot of people interested in saving the original New Testament documents, right? Except those early Christians, of course. And this is common for ancient documents. We don't have any of the original ancient documents. All we have are copies. And so any ancient work, any ancient book, any ancient document, we have to do this exact same process with to try to recreate the original. So the question that we ask, historians ask, we know we don't have the original, but do we have an accurate copy? That's the key question. Don't have the original, do we have an accurate copy? Bart Ehrman says no. You guys might be familiar with Bart Ehrman. He's a very popular, at the popular level. He's a scholar, okay? But he's very popular. He's written a lot of popular level books. So you might have heard he made a lot of, a big name for himself, especially during when the Dan Brown novels were really popular, the Da Vinci Code and things like that. He was speaking, being interviewed, writing a lot of popular level books during that time, maybe 10, 15 years ago, and has been fairly well known ever since. So Bart Ehrman is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, and my opinion of him is that he scares people away from the New Testament by over-sensationalizing some of these issues that we're going to be talking about, okay? Now, he's a scholar. He knows the facts, but I feel like he over-sensationalizes these issues, and by doing so, scares people away from thinking that the New Testament is historically reliable. For example, I'll just give you an example. He'll say things like, the copy of the Bible that we have, the copy of the New Testament that we have today, has thousands of errors in it. And technically that's true. Technically that's true. The copy of the Bible that we all have and use in our devotions in our churches has thousands of errors in it. Now, if that's all you say, or if that's all you know, that's troubling. But that's not the whole story, as we'll see tonight. Okay? We'll see, even towards the end of his book, he admits all these errors really aren't that big of a deal. Interesting enough, he used to be a Christian. He left, according to his own testimony, he left Christianity over the problem of evil. So it was a philosophical issue, not really a textual criticism issue that caused him to leave Christianity. But he is an expert. He is a scholar in the field of what's called textual criticism. There's Christians, non-Christians, atheists, all sorts of people work in this field. It sounds bad, like you're criticizing the text, the New Testament, but all it means is that as a historian, you're trying to recreate the original. You're bringing some skepticism, of course, to it, but the attempt is to criticize various copies, look at the copies to try to recreate the original. So good, solid Christians work in this field, evangelicals, as well as non-Christians like Bart Ehrman. Now, he studied under the Michael Jordan of this field. All right? People say that I should start using LeBron James now as the gold standard. He's the LeBron James of this field, okay? Bruce Metzger. In fact, you probably don't have your Bibles with you, but when I do this in churches, I usually encourage people to look at the front of their Bible, and most of the time you're going to find his name. Because if he wasn't the one that helped work on that translation, then people used him as a resource to do that translation. Just because he is the man when it comes to this field of textual criticism. He was at Princeton for decades and is widely known as really the top figure in this field of textual criticism. Now, he is who Bart Ehrman studied under, okay? So when Bart Ehrman did his studies, got his terminal degree, he did it at Princeton under Bruce Metzger. So here's a quote from Ehrman about Metzger. Does that make sense? Ehrman's the skeptic here, the atheist, saying the New Testament's not historically reliable. He studied under Metzger. So here now I'm going to give you a quote from Ehrman about Metzger. Take a look. So Ehrman, in this book, is quoting Jesus. He says, Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times. And I dedicated this book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into this field and the person who trained me in it. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him. Even though we may disagree on important religious questions, Metzger is a firmly committed Christian. And obviously Ehrman is not. He's an atheist now. However, we are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. And we'll see that as we go through this material. So, Metzger disagrees with Ehrman over the historical reliability of the New Testament. Bruce Metzger is famously well known as believing and making arguments that our New Testament is an accurate copy of the original. So why does he think that? That's what we want to look at tonight. What are Metzger's reasons for thinking the copy of the New Testament we have today is accurate to the original? Here are the main two reasons. The length of time between when the original was written and the earliest surviving copy that we have today. The second issue that leads Metzger to believe that we have an accurate copy of the New Testament is because of the numbers of copies we have. Now I'm going to turn over to you guys to talk at the table here for a few minutes. Why would these be the most important issues? All right, go ahead. I'll give you a few minutes. If you're interested in what I talked about at the beginning, this issue of epistemology and how do we know things, this is one of the top three issues in philosophy. Metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, right, are the three branches of philosophy. And the University of Nebraska had a great philosophy professor. He was there for, I think, 30 years. I had him for philosophy when I was a student back in the 90s. He's no longer at the University of Nebraska, but he's a world-famous philosopher by the name of Robert Audi. And he specializes in this area of epistemology. How do we know things? How can we become justified in claiming we know something? And here's a book I'll pass around. You guys can take a look at this book of his, published by Oxford University Press. right? But he's talking here about our Christian faith. How do we know Christianity is true, for instance? So the book is called Rationality and Religious Commitment. Some of the chapters, rationality and thought and action, justification, knowledge and reasonableness, belief, faith, acceptance, hope, religion, theology, morality, the rationality of religious commitment in the world, internal challenges to the rationality of religious commitment, the problem of evil, the challenge of naturalism. So here you've got somebody who was a philosophy professor at our own university for 30 years, worldwide known philosopher who's writing on these issues near and dear to our heart. I think this is golden. So take a look at this, pass it around, take a picture of it if you're interested in reading it, because I want that copy back. That's my copy. And I just saw that the philosophy department is having a conference coming up soon on epistemology, bringing in speakers from around the country. So all I'm saying is, if you're interested in thinking through how can we know things, this conference might be for you. They're bringing in different philosophers from around the country. At least one of them I know for sure is a Christian from the University of St. Louis, which is a Catholic university. But I looked up his CV, and he's worked with Esther Meek, an evangelical Christian, and has made arguments about the hiddenness of God. That's a big issue in epistemology for us as Christians. So even this conference coming up at UNL is going to be discussing these sort of issues. Epistemology is a huge topic in philosophy. Okay, so back to what we're doing here. I heard some of your conversations. I think you're right on the money, right? The earlier we have a copy compared to the original, the less room there is for error, right? That makes sense. If the original was written 1,000 years ago and the earliest copy we have is from 100 years ago, well, that's a lot of room in there for error to creep in, right? So what historians like to see is early copies, as close to the original when the original was written as possible. And then the number of copies we have, clearly the more copies we have to look at, the more we can compare to try to get back to the original. So let's do a competition this evening. Let's start with the first one, the length of time from when the original was written to the earliest surviving copy that we have nowadays. Let's do a little bit of competition with other famous ancient documents. So take a look at this. How about Aristotle? Can't get much more famous than that, right? You probably have to study Aristotle. I did in college, even though I was a business major, Nicomachean ethics, so on and so forth, right? We all read and study Aristotle. But take a look at this. He wrote 300 BC, and the earliest surviving copy we have of his works, 1100 AD. So that's a period of 1,400 years where we have nothing. It's a long stretch where errors could creep in, mistakes could creep in. But we still read Aristotle. We still are fairly confident in, when we read his books, that that's pretty much what he wrote and said. Herodotus is a famous historian, Greek historian from the ancient world. A lot of what we know about the ancient Greek world comes from his history books, if you will. He wrote 400 BC, and the earliest surviving copy we have of his works is from AD 900. So again, similar, 1,300 years. Caesar's Gallic War, everybody knows who Caesar is, right? He wrote this in 50 BC. Earliest surviving copy we have is 900, so 950 years. Probably the most famous work from the ancient world is Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. I'm sure you all had to gruel through that in school. Now, amazingly enough, we have a copy of the Odyssey from 300 BC. It must have just been preserved in a just the right, perfect environment for it to survive all these centuries. But still, he wrote it in 800 BC, so that's still a 500-year period where, just imagine all of the mistakes and errors that could have, I'm not saying they did, but the possibility for errors and mistakes to creep in, 500 years, quite a bit of time. So of all these ancient documents that we trust and we read for the most part, not with absolute certainty of course, how do they compare to the New Testament? Well, most scholars will agree that the New Testament was finished by the end of the first century. A lot of debate on exactly when, maybe especially the last few letters, last few books, Revelation, exactly when, but most would agree conservatively that it was finished by 100 AD. So what is the earliest copy of the New Testament that we have? I'm going to give you a few, and they have weird names. Sometimes they're named by the person who found them. Sometimes they're named by the person who was in charge of the archaeological dig. Okay, so they're going to have strange names, but I want to give you a few of these ancient copies that we have. First one I want to tell you about is the Chester Beatty papyri, or the Chester Beatty manuscript, and that dates from 250 AD. Now this contains most of the New Testament, including all 4 Gospels. Okay? So even if this is all we had, we're down to 150 years from when the original was written to the earliest surviving copy. That blows everybody else we looked at out of the water, even if this is all we had. Okay? But we have more. Consider the Bodmer papyri, or the Bodmer manuscript. Now this includes several New Testament books, and it's dated to around 200. And I'll just get right to the chase. I'll get to you the last one. This is the earliest so far that we've discovered. It's called the John Ryland papyri, and it dates around 120 to 140 AD. It's a portion of the Gospel of John. Now there's been a lot of talk lately, the last few years, about a manuscript that was discovered, a portion of Mark, Gospel of Mark, that might end up being dated in the 1st century. The scholars haven't come out and said that conclusively yet because they want to be sure before they do so. They're still evaluating, and it might, they might find out it was from 500-600 AD. So we don't want to, get too far ahead of ourselves. But you can look it up online, do some more research about it. I don't think it has a name yet. But if they conclude, right, they're having Christian, non-Christian scholars, everybody evaluate this. If it is discovered to truly be a portion of Mark from the 1st century, that'll be mind-blowing. But at least for now, this is what we have to go on. So now, in a sense, we're narrowing it down to, 50 years, which for an ancient document is out of this world. It's unlike any ancient document we have to try to recreate. To have a copy that is so early compared to the original, it's quite impressive from a historical perspective. Now, I said there's 2 things that are important. The length of time between when the original was written and the earliest surviving copy, and the second thing is the number of copies that we have. Now, why is that important? Now, to explain more fully why this is important, I have a fun story for you. A fun family story. So in our family, we have 4 children, the youngest of which is 14 now. So when they were younger, when they were children, and Will can attest to this, one of the punishments we had in our household, one of many, but one of the punishments was that if you got in trouble, sometimes you would have to copy a page out of the dictionary. Now, if you made too many mistakes, you would have to redo it. So it was a very grueling, meticulous process. Every semicolon, every letter, everything correct, or else you'd have to do it again. So let's pretend, hypothetically, you guys are in my family. And I don't know what you did, but let's just say it was really bad. All right? You guys all did something, and your punishment is you all have to copy this page out of a dictionary. Sometimes I do this with a youth group. I'll bring a dictionary and I'll rip a page out, and boy, now I got their attention. You're ripping a book. So I got a page out of the dictionary here, and I'm going to pass it around to you guys, and you all have to copy it. That's your punishment. Now let's say you all do that. You copy it. I get the original page of the dictionary back, and I destroy it. I rip it up, chew it up, spit it, burn it. It's gone. The original is disappeared. All we have left are the copies that you guys made. Now you're going to make mistakes, right? I mean, it's just, especially if I have you do it quickly or whatever, you're going to make mistakes. However, if I took all of the copies that you made, I could recreate that original page from the dictionary with a fairly high degree of accuracy. There's going to be dozens of mistakes, maybe even hundreds among all of you, if we count up all the individual mistakes. See where I'm going with this? But I could recreate the original with a fairly high degree of accuracy because you're going to make mistakes in different places. You might misspell a word in the first line, but everybody else will get that word spelled right. So if the word is spelled correctly 19 times but misspelled one, well, I know that that was a mistake there, and I can just go with the majority, right? Sometimes it's not always that easy, but you get the idea. And let's say that you guys took your copies, took them to your respective communities, families, friends, dorm rooms, and everybody there made copies, and then they would take them back to their families or where they're from, around Nebraska or around the country, around the world, and they would make copies. Can you see how eventually we would have thousands of copies? And, historically, all I would have would be a handful from those various places, but I could bring them back together and try to recreate the original from those copies and mistakes. And that's what textual criticism is all about. Recreating the original from these copies, even though these copies don't agree with each other. So just a visual example here. Don't have the original anymore. All we have are copies. And there's mistakes. If you want to count up the mistakes, which we do as textual critics, right, to be consistent and technical, we count every single mistake that we find. So there's many, many, many mistakes. But if you line them up, it's fairly obvious what the original said. We can recreate the original with a fairly high degree of accuracy. And the more copies we have to look at and compare, the higher degree of accuracy we can attain. Does that make sense? So let's do another competition here. How many copies do we have of these ancient documents? Aristotle, we have 5 copies. Not very many. Herodotus, 8. Move on up. Caesar's Gallic War, we have 10 copies, right? We have to compare with to each other. Now, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, that was like the Bible of the ancient world and the Greek world, so to speak, right? It was the book that everybody had, the book that everybody read. And so we actually have several hundred copies. Can you imagine if that was your job? To evaluate and compare 643 copies of the Iliad to see where the differences are and try to recreate. Glad that's not my job. So how does this compare to the New Testament? So when it comes to the New Testament, we have almost 6,000 Greek copies, 9,000 Latin copies, and 8,000 copies from other languages. So do the math. You engineers have already done it in your head. What are we talking? 23,000 copies? How would you like that to be your job? Now, I'm so thankful for people like Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman and people who work in this field, because what they're doing is very valuable, and I'm thankful for them. I'm just glad it's not my job. It's very meticulous work to compare these copies and try to recreate the original. New manuscripts are being discovered, and then there's new work that needs to be done. And so this is an ongoing process, right? Here's some other facts that might be interesting to you. So, process these slowly because they're numbers and you kind of have to process what's being communicated here. So in the New Testament, there's about 8,000 verses. Okay, 27 books, some are bigger than others. About 8,000 verses, or 8,000 sentences, if you will, right? Now, if you take all the manuscripts we have from the 2nd century, that would be from 100 AD to 200 AD. So manuscripts we have from the 2nd century, within those manuscripts are almost half of the New Testament. So almost half of the New Testament we have from within 100 years of the originals being completed, right? Fairly impressive. Another factoid for you. Besides these copies, we also have what's called commentaries. Commentaries is where pastors or theologians write books to try to explain what the New Testament is saying. And oftentimes when people would write such books, they would quote the New Testament in order to make their theological point or their theological argument. And if you look at all of these early Christians, these early, call them church fathers, but they were just the early pastors and theologians of Christianity. If you look at their works, there's 36,000 quotations. So those help confirm and you can compare to try to recreate the original. We already noted that there's 19,000 manuscripts in other languages. And so this is kind of a fun tidbit. If you would stack up all of these manuscripts, it would end up being over a mile high. Quite a lot of work. That's why there's so many people that specialize in this field of textual criticism. So let's draw this to a close. One more competition here. By doing all this work, all this textual criticism, looking at all these copies, how accurate can we get? You want to put a number on it, put a percentage on it. How accurate can we be in recreating the original? And we'll just take the top two. We won't go through all of them again, but just the top two. Everybody's in agreement that the Iliad, Homer's work, is one of the best documented works from the ancient world. So, people who do this sort of textual criticism with Homer's Iliad, they say that we can get to about 95% accuracy to the original. Things that are just, we don't know for sure, 95% is fairly good, right? How's that compared to the New Testament? Now, this is a quote I'm going to give you. Again, it's from Bruce Metzger, recognized expert in this field. For decades, he was the man at Princeton, professor, highly respected even by Bart Ehrman, the atheist, right? And according to Bruce Metzger, he claims that we can recreate the original New Testament with the degree of accuracy at 99.5% because of the early copies and the multitude of copies that we have to compare. Just like we would do hypothetically with that page out of the dictionary. Now, sometimes people still get worried about this 0.5%, and I can understand that, right? And if you think about it, if it's some very important 0.5%, like Jesus rose from the dead, if that was part of the 0.5%, that would be of a concern. So, what is this 0.5% that we're still just fairly uncertain on? Well, look what Ehrman says about it. This is Bart Ehrman, the atheist again, and he's talking about Metzger. Okay? So Ehrman wrote, if Metzger and I were put in a room and we were told we had to hammer out a consensus on what we thought the original text in the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement. Maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of thousands. So the position I argue for here in this book doesn't actually stand at odds with Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. So by the time you get to the end of his book and he gets past all the sensationalizing, he admits that even this 0.5% doesn't really affect any major Christian doctrines. And this isn't a secret. It feels like a secret sometimes with kids and teenagers who grew up in the church because they're just not exposed to this stuff. But if you get a copy of the Greek New Testament, all of these, they're called variants or errors, if you will, things that we're just not sure about. If you get a Greek New Testament, which everybody does who goes to seminary, like I did, and had to study the Greek, you study from the Greek New Testament, and it lists all these variants right there at the bottom. Where the variants are, what scholars think the variant said this, and what scholars think the variant said that. So it's not a secret. In fact, it's studied by everybody who goes to seminary to be a pastor. I'll send this around if you guys want to take a look at it. You've never seen a Greek New Testament before. So he's over-sensationalizing things that just, unfortunately, most people aren't aware of. Okay? So there's many, many differences, many, many errors. Most of them are spelling errors, spelling differences. Sometimes there's a lot of name differences. Sometimes a copier would write Peter. Somebody else would call him Cephas, right? He had many different names. One place, maybe they describe the camel as being very big. Somewhere else, they say the camel was huge, right? Or large. But does that really change the meaning of the verse? No. So most of the variants, errors, if you will, have to do with things like that. And of that 0.5%, only 1% of those affect the meaning of the verse in any significant way, and none of them have to do with important Christian beliefs like Jesus' resurrection. So here's just one more quote as we wrap things up. This is from Frederick Kenyon. He was the director of the British Museum. He wrote that it cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain. Not absolutely certain. You know what I mean by that. Especially this is the case with the New Testament. So if you'd like to explore this issue more, this might be a good resource for you. I'll let you jot down this website. There's also debates out there between Bart Ehrman and New Testament, Christian New Testament scholars like Wallace, Daniel Wallace. I wanted to say William Wallace. The last thing I want to cover tonight, I know I keep saying that, but we are going to wrap this up. The last thing I want to talk about tonight is this idea that you don't see it at the scholarly level, but sometimes at the popular level you'll see this idea. And it's the idea that the New Testament has been lost in translation. That, I mean, come on, the New Testament's been translated so many times, from this language to this language, and then from this language to that language. And we've all played the telephone game. You sit kids in a circle, and you give the first child a sentence, and then he has to whisper in the ear of the next child. And then by the time you get to the beginning or the end of the circle, the sentence is completely muddied, right? We've all played that game. That's how Bible translation works. And so it's been translated so many times that we can't trust. There's no way we could know what the original said because it's been lost in translation. So how would you respond to that objection? I'll give you guys a few minutes to chat about that. How would you respond if somebody gave you that objection? Now, this objection, if you ever do get it, it's fairly easy to answer. This objection stems from just a misunderstanding on how translation works. It's not as though the New Testament was translated into one language and then from that translated into another and then from that translated into another. No, whenever we make a new translation, and many new translations are made, obviously, and you probably are aware of at least 10 different English translations, but whenever we make a new translation of the New Testament, we don't make it from a previous English translation. We go back to the original Greek. So, for example, if we discover a new language or we come across a tribe in Indonesia or Africa and we want to translate the Bible into their language, we don't use our English New Testament to do so. No, we translate from the original Greek. So it's not as though it's translated over and over and over again. No, we always go back to the original Greek to make any new translation. So sometimes people ask then, well, why are there so many English translations? Why do we keep making new translations? It's not because the Greek or the original New Testament in Greek has changed. It's because our English is changing. Language, the words that we use to communicate are very fluid. Language changes like crazy. And it's impossible. I feel bad for the people that try to write dictionaries because language just changes. Just think generationally. We use words now to mean things that 10, 20 years ago, the previous generation didn't used almost in the opposite way. And there's no way to control that. Teachers try. But it's impossible. Language is fluid. It's changing constantly. Sometimes at the speed of light. I mean, it's just, then you got poets that come along and they use words in a new creative way, and then all of a sudden, boom, it goes off in a different direction. So just to give you an example, right, one of the most classic English translations is the good old KJV. And if you really want to be authentic, you use the 1611 King James Version. And here are some verses that in modern English we would have no idea what they mean because we just don't use those words in English anymore. And in fact, some of these words have completely flip-flopped in meaning. The word let used to mean to stop somebody. And in fact, it's still used that way in tennis. I don't know if you guys play tennis or watch tennis on TV, but when the ball hits the net, some people think that the person is saying net. No, they're actually saying let with an L because the ball was stopped from going over. It was letted. But in English, that is completely flip-flopped now, where most of the time we use the word let to mean to allow something. Yeah, I'll let you take the car this weekend. Yeah, I'll let you come over. And so we have to retranslate the New Testament, not because the Greek has changed, but because our English language is changing. Okay? But whenever we do that, we go back to the original Greek. Now, you might be interested to know that the Greek language, Koine Greek, is one of the most stable languages in history. And it's just, I guess, God's providence, if you think of it that way. As I said, you know how fluid language is. Our English language is constantly changing. Well, Koine Greek experienced about a 400-year period where it was the standard official language of the entire world. So we have a 400-year period where we can understand and study historically Koine Greek, various documents during those 400 years, so that we make sure we are interpreting the Koine Greek of the New Testament correctly. It's just a gold mine. The reason that happened was, if you know your history, right? Alexander the Great took over the world, the Greek emperor, Alexander the Great, and he said, in my kingdom, Greek is going to be the official language. And it was. for about 400 years. It was very stable, very consistent for 400 years, which is unheard of in the history of human language as far as we know. So it's great that the New Testament was written right in the middle of that 400-year period, and we can study, a lot of work is done to understand Koine Greek. In fact, I've got a lot of friends who went to seminary to be pastors that know Koine Greek so well they can speak and write in it, and not only interpret it and read it, but they can speak and write in it. So it's a very historically stable language. All right, let's wrap it up there. I know I've gone over a little bit tonight. Different ways you can get involved with Ratio Christi. I'll just put that up there now. You guys can glance through that. The 2 books that I've been recommending all semester, if you want to see some of this stuff in print, or you want to write a paper on it. I know a student who this week is going to give a presentation at UNL in their class, and they're going to do their presentation on this issue, the historical reliability of the New Testament. It's not a history class, not a religion class, but if you get the opportunity to choose your subject, use it as an opportunity to make a case for Christianity. If you do that, you're going to need some resources. This would be a good popular level resource. Can't quote it because it's not an academic resource, but good popular level just to help us understand the issues. By the way, this guy's coming to speak at UNL in February. We're bringing him in. But if you need an academic resource, if you need something you can quote in an academic paper at a university, this is a guy that you can quote. And you can find the same sort of material, just in a much more scholarly, deep way, with more details, of course. But he's a respected scholar at Oxford University. So this is definitely an academic resource that you can quote till the cows come home. So I'll send these around. You guys can take a look, take a picture, write down the titles, authors. But I need those back. Those are my copies. Well, I know we've gone a bit late. It's 9 o'clock, but I do like to try to have some time for Q&A. So if somebody could run the mic up here for us. What questions do you guys have? Or are there any questions from folks that are watching live? Yes, it's going.
Do you know off the top of your head how old the oldest copy of the Septuagint is?
Not off the top of my head. I have to look it up. I'll repeat the question. What's the oldest surviving extant copy of the Septuagint? And the Septuagint was basically just the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And off the top of my head, I don't know. Yeah. But Google does.
So we got Luke with us tonight, and hi Luke.
Our Luke?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. And
good
so
deal.
The question is, so Mark is considered by scholars to be our first gospel.
Some scholars, yep. Mm-hmm.
And it almost certainly contains a later edition in Mark 16, specifically verses 9 through 20. This is where Jesus raises from the dead and appears to others. And it's also also where Jesus says his believers can drink poison and not be harmed. So the question is, isn't this problematic for defending the resurrection as historical fact? And wouldn't this point to the resurrection simply being part of the legendary development?
Okay, I think I know where he's going with that. So sometimes the story is told that again, this goes back to one of the theories that all these ideas about Jesus being God and doing miracles were, legends that developed later. And, part of that story is that the Gospels, if you lay out the Gospels chronologically, you'll kind of see that. So maybe, for example, if Mark was written first, there's less miraculous stuff in there. There's less maybe claims of him being deity than as opposed to when you get to John, which according to this story, John was written the latest. But then within John is the most grandiose miracles, the most claims, the most obvious claims to deity. And so you kind of can, if you lay it out chronologically, you'll see a progression of these claims getting more grandiose. And I think that theory can just be disproven historically, right? Some of these resources I've passed around, if you want to go through and look at the evidence, I think that theory falls apart when you evaluate the details. Not everybody agrees that Mark was the first gospel that was written in the first place. There's a lot of scholars, both Christian and non-Christians, who are, I forget the official name, Matthean, but think that Matthew was actually written first. And I don't have a position, this isn't my field, so I haven't done a ton of research to even have my own position on that issue. But I just know, I'm aware that there are good scholars on both sides. So to even make the case, I think you're already dancing on thin ice. So, and there's so many other things, as we'll see, that go back so early. Let me say it this way, just to make it very quick. Even if we didn't have let's say we didn't have the Gospels, and in fact, there are the letters of the New Testament that have the most historical evidence for them are a handful of Paul's letters. So Paul wrote 13 letters of the 27 New Testament books, and there's 5 or 6 of them that are just so, the evidence for them is just so overwhelming. Let's say that's all we had then. We didn't have the Gospels. All we had were those 4 or 5 letters from Paul that virtually all scholars agree upon. There's very clear evidence that the early Christians understood and were saying that Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus did miracles, Jesus claimed to be God. So regardless of any possible issues with the Gospels, we have other things. Sometimes people get really, really worried, and they shouldn't, I don't think. But sometimes Christians, maybe when they hear this for the first time, get concerned that possibly, just make it simple, Matthew used some of Mark or Luke used some of Mark to write their gospel. And even if you read the first chapter of Luke, Luke says that he used other resources. In other words, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, he explains to the reader that he interviewed people, he looked at other sources. In other words, Luke himself did some historical research to write out the gospel. So the fact that these gospel writers used other sources, even if there is a Q document, right, that some of the gospel writers utilized in their research and helped them write out their account, even if there is this mysterious Q document that existed, it would be pre-gospel material, something written down called Q. Scholars refer to it as, even if it was a thing, we're not sure. But one theory is that this Q document existed, and for instance, Matthew and Mark both utilized it to write some of their account. And that's why you see some crossover between the Gospels. Couldn't be explained by this other document. And even if that's the case, that's not a problem for us. That's not an issue. Luke explains that he used other resources. That, I don't think, causes us, at least, let me say it this way, if we have our historian hats on, that causes us no problem whatsoever. If we put on our theology hats, and we're wrestling now with the doctrine of inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture, then we might have some questions about how these folks wrote God's Word, how they went about it. Because sometimes, for some Christians, the idea of Bible writers having to do historical research doesn't mesh with their idea that God just told them what to write and they wrote it. But I think that just comes from a misunderstanding among Christians on the doctrine of inspiration. But we're not there yet. Remember, that's next semester. We're not talking about theology. We're not talking about the Bible being God's Word. We're just evaluating it and asking if it's historically reliable ancient documents. So we're merely looking at it with our historian hats on. All right, any other questions?
I have one.
Please.
I've done a lot of research, or I've awakened my eyes to statements that you apply to themselves and they kind of put on weaker ground. And earlier in your talk, you said something about being certain about stuff. And so I took your statement about how we can't be absolutely certain about something, and I applied it to itself. And so, how certain are you about that?
Not absolutely.
Yeah. So does that play in at all, or can you? Would you be persuaded that you could be absolutely certain about something? I mean, I'm trying to like understand how that principle that I have about applying claims to themselves works with that statement.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it defeats it,
Okay.
right? You're talking about the boomerang effect, for those in the room who don't know. If somebody makes a claim, one way to push back against that claim is to see if that claim, if applied back to itself, would then destroy itself. So think of it as like the boomerang technique. And so Wesley is very appropriately asking that sort of question about my statement. We can't be absolutely certain about anything. Well, can be absolutely certain about that. That's a very appropriate thing to do, right? And my reply, and I've done this many, many times with many, many people in many, many conversations, is just agree, yes. If I'm going to be consistent in this position, which is fairly common in epistemology, then yes, you have to consistently agree that even my position about not being able to be absolutely certain about things cannot be held with absolute certainty. So I could be wrong about this. And, if there's good reasons or evidence or argumentation that somebody could give me to change my mind, I will. So the bottom line is, I think the easiest way to understand this is that we are not, the only way, people use the term certainty very loosely, and I do too, right? I'm certain that my wife is here in the room. Okay, I'm using that very colloquially, very, normally. We use the word certain all the time in that way. And I'm not going to be the guy in the room who holds up their hand and says, well, technically. So we also say things like the sun is going to rise tomorrow at 6:30. Technically, is the sun going to rise? No. But that's part of the problem with our human language, right? So we can be, when we say certain, oftentimes what we mean by that is we don't have any reason to doubt. I have no reason to doubt my wife is in the room right now. So I'm certain about it. In philosophy, when we get more technical about what we really mean by things, in philosophy, when we're having this conversation about human knowledge, and we're talking about absolute certainty, we're saying something more than just, I don't have a good reason to doubt that right now. Absolute certainty in the field of philosophy is this level of immediate knowledge where you know something without any inference. Like right now, I know that my wife is in the room because of my senses, and I trust my cognitive faculties. I have all of these things, right, that I'm relying on to give me that knowledge. If you know something with absolute certainty, you don't use anything in between the object and your knowledge of it. There's no inferences, there's no deduction, there's no induction. And the only way to have that sort of infinite, absolute certainty or knowledge is to be an omniscient being, which we understand God to be. So that level of certainty is more than just, I don't have a good reason to doubt it right now. If you really grasp the idea of absolute certainty, I think you would agree that we just cannot achieve that level. We could be 99.999%, however you want to say it, but 100% certainty, I just don't think it's possible. But I could be wrong. You'd have to argue me out of that position, though. Well, that's 3 good questions and 3 long-winded answers. So let's end the night. Looks like there's more food over there. And like we always say, feel free to continue the discussion. Stay here and chat as long as you'd like. Thanks for coming tonight, guys.
Can you start clapping, please? Thank you! Now I can. Nobody.